The People's National Congress regime during the 1978 to 1980 period was totally isolated from not only the international community, but Guyanese as well, due to its discriminatory and oppressive rule at that time. This was part of the testimony given by Minister of Home Affairs and General Secretary of the PVP, Clement Roy, as he entered the witness box on the fourth day of round 7 of the historical Walter Rodney Commission of Inquiry. Given his vast knowledge and experience in the political arena, Mr. Roy told the inquiry that he can attest to the political and economic atmosphere prior to the time of Dr. Walter Rodney's assassination. He spoke of the discriminatory policies of the PNC regime that led its supporters and many other Guyanese resisting the oppression.
The country was saddled with a huge foreign debt. The government could not honor the debts that it had owed to the international financial institutions, that the multilateral debt and even the bilateral debts could not be honored. There were serious negotiations with the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank to try to develop a package to rescue Guyana from this situation. In the meantime, production and productivity of our major exports had declined significantly: rice, sugar, bauxite. And coupled with that, of course, we didn't, as a result of the country's inability to export, we couldn't earn foreign exchange. And because we couldn't earn foreign exchange, there were rigid exchange controls. In those days, to get money to leave the country, foreign currency, you had to go to the bank again and fill up quite a number of forms, which at the end would see you receiving $15 at the amount of money that was allowed for every citizen to leave the country. That would be stamped at the back of your passport. And so there were these foreign exchange controls. In addition to that, the private sector was almost decimated because they had no foreign exchange to import goods, and they were in competition with what was called the External Trade Bureau, the ETB, which was a state institution that was set up to eventually marginalize the commercial private sector.
I'm sorry, I didn't get that name.
The External Trade Bureau, the ETB.
And who set up this organization?
This was set up by the state. The state established that.
And the purpose of this organization?
The purpose for that organization was to control import and exports, to dispense licenses for the importation of certain type of goods, what one could describe as, like cars, motorcycles, and even some basic things like cutlasses and so forth. Anything that had to do with the disbursement of foreign exchange, one had to go through the Bank of Guyana, the ETB, and a whole plethora of state institutions before you could either end up being frustrated or you get a few dollars, a fistful of dollars, like, to do your business. So the economic situation was one where you had these rigid exchange controls, production and productivity of our major exports declining, hardly any foreign exchange being earned, and emphasis on the use of things like rice flour and local things, locally produced commodities, as substitutes for imports. People were accustomed to using certain commodities that were imported into the country, which were no longer available. Toilet paper. Incidentally, when I look at the situation in Venezuela now, I remember those days in Guyana. Toilet paper, basic food items were never available in the shops. And whenever there was something available in the shops, you would know when it is available without even going in the shop. because there would be a long line, mainly of housewives with bags, waiting to get at least 2 or 3 of those products.
Like many other witnesses, Mr. Roy testified of the rigged 1978 referendum, as well as the poor voter turnout of a measly 13%. This, he believes, attested to the loss of confidence by the populace in the PNC dictatorship. Mr. Roy said Dr. Rodney had a great influence and following that resulted in many consultations with PPP leader Dr. Chetty Jagan, who shared a similar ideology.
Rodney was a Marxist scholar. Most of his scientific and political investigation was based on Marxist theory and using Marxism as a tool, as a scientific tool to investigate, whether it's in Africa, the Caribbean, or whatever parts of the world. So, on the other hand, Dr. Jagan used the same kind of scientific methodology to analyze social and political developments. And so there was basically hardly any differences in ideological orientation, save and except that Dr. Jagan was known as an established communist leader, a Marxist, whereas Dr. Rodney was not seen, was not cast in such a light. He was cast more in the light of a revolutionary Democrat, a revolutionary leader, wanting to do something for his people.
Was a revolutionary Democrat?
Yes, Mr. Roy.
It seems to me, though, that you're making an important distinction that this shared ideology of both men related to a mode of analysis rather than political objectives.
I really don't see, with due respect, Mr. Chairman, there's a symbiotic relationship between the two. Here were 2 men that use Marxism as a tool to investigate.
They call it tool of analysis.
Yes, tool of analysis, scientific investigation. The same tool was applied in the Guyanese context. But Marxists don't always agree on everything because of the nature of the science. So, while that might have been the case, the fact of the matter is that they had certain common goals. And the basic common goal in Guyana was that the people of this country at that time needed a better life.
He said Dr. Jagan and Dr. Rodney worked together to influence the trade unions, private and religious organizations, intellects, and the working class, taking advantage of the isolation of the PNC dictatorship with the aim of achieving a united change.
When we talk about the time when Dr. Rodney appeared on the scene, the fact of the matter is, if I may speak in social scientific terms, he arrived in the situation in the country at the time when the social and economic conditions in the country was ripe for the action that he was advocating to bear fruit. The correlation of social and political forces in the country, the objective and objective factors, were all matured. So that when Walter Rodney arrived on the scene, on the political scene, he was about to make history. Because all the conditions in the country were ripe for the kind of struggle he was advocating.
And what kind of struggle was that?
He was advocating mass political struggle, work among the trade unions, among the workers in various parts of the country. He was convinced that the situation as it existed and the rising political consciousness of the people would, if given the correct political leadership, united leadership, with cooperation between the People's Progressive Party, which was the major opposition party at the time, and the Working People Alliance, all of this could be brought to a confluence that would result in the removal of the PNC regime. That was his vision.
Thank you. So when the WPA arrived on the scene,
No, not the WPA. The WPA was
Walter
already
Rodney.
there. Yeah.
So when Walter Rodney arrived on the scene, what was the interaction like between Walter Rodney and the People's Progressive Party?
It was very healthy, very constructive, and I would say productive, in the sense that Dr. Jagan and Dr. Rodney would meet on a frequent basis at our party headquarters, Freedom House. And they would usually meet on a one-on-one basis. They met together by themselves and engaged in discussions, sometimes very lengthy discussions. Walter came alone to Freedom House, and after those discussions, he would say hello to everyone that was around the party office at the time, and then leave, and then eventually Dr. Jagan, whenever we held meetings of the leadership of the party, he would brief us on what those conversations were like with Dr. Rodney. But we would never be part of those discussions. He would eventually brief us on those discussions that took place. And the party was always in agreement with the position that Dr. Jagan took in his conversations with Dr. Rodney, and vice versa.
Once again, evidence of the state-sponsored House of Israel's brutality against persons at public meetings, denial of basic human rights, and acts of state terrorism were brought to the attention of the Commission.
During the period under review, political violence was carried out not only by the PNC, but also by the House of Israel, who was protected by the government of the day. What sort of protection was offered to the PNC and the House of Israel?
Well, first of all, Rabbi Washington, also known as David Hill, he was a close friend of the administration at the time. And these things were openly flaunted. I mean, there were photographs appearing all over the place with Rabbi Washington and President Burnham. So, I mean, for you to be having photographs with the president so frequently, by implication, you must be a friend and not an enemy of the president. In addition to that, the access to the radio station, to have every Saturday around 1 or 2 o'clock a radio program by the House of Israel. In those days, to have access to the radio, to have a program like that, you had to have strings to pull. And then the fact that we were told, and these House of Israel people had weapons, had firearms. In those days, to carry a firearm or to even possess a firearm and to be at a political meeting of the opposition parties, whether it's the CDD or the WP or the PPP, those were very unusual and prized possessions to have in those days. So all of those things put together made many conclude that the concubinage between the House of Israel and the ruling party was one that bore many fruits.
Mr. Roy told commissioners that he can confirm, beyond a shadow of doubt, since investigations conducted when he attained the ministerial post have revealed this. He said people would be seen outside the PPP headquarters, Freedom House, taking notes of persons entering and leaving, as well as vehicle numbers on a daily basis.
Sometimes they would follow you, but then again they had more than one. Of course, in those days you didn't have a cell phone to call and say, look, he's moving here, he's moving. Their cell phones didn't exist in those days. So sometimes they had to follow you, or sometimes they have to give a signal to someone else that, you know,
I
is
have a
moving in
note
one
that
direction or the other.
I have a note that based on what I call your informed suspicion, that based on the experience, your knowledge over the years, your field, I call it an informed suspicion. Would that be about accurate, way of summarizing?
I think, sir, that's putting it a little too formally.
Yes, yes.
That's putting it, but I don't have a problem with that. But I think it's something more than that.
Well,
It's something that really you can't actually describe.
It was akin to
It's something like a chemistry.
yeah, yeah.
Something like a chemistry, political chemistry.
But in addition to that, you actually did see people photograph you, sir.
Yes, I saw people photograph me. I saw people photograph other standers by at public meetings.
And you did see people follow you around at these meetings
At the meetings, people did follow you around.
and pay.
They were standing not far from you to hear what the conversation was about while you were talking to people. They would be standing nearby, listening to what you were saying, making notes of what you were saying. Some were just committing it to memory. You know, and I found that very unusual because, I mean, nobody in the struggle in those days would be interested in that kind of activity. They would be, you know, engaged in animated in a conversation that had nothing to do with that kind of activity. So that's how I convinced myself or became conscious of the fact that these people, these individuals were agents of the state, as it were. Yes.
Minister Rohi, I wish to ask you, are you aware of whether Dr. Jagan was ever under surveillance, from your knowledge?
Dr. Jagan?
Yes.
Beyond the shadow of a doubt, he was under surveillance.
This evidence was corroborated by several other social and political activists who testified at the Commission since its formal hearing in April 2014. Mr. Rohi also spoke extensively of Burnham's leadership style, which he believes resulted in citizens becoming frustrated and the country impoverished.
State and para-organizations, all of these were armed, in addition to those who had firearms that were not legally given to them. So when you did the calculation, this is how it came out. The People's Militia, the National Service, the police, the Guyana Defense Force, apart from their extensions. These were huge bodies in the country. The Guyana National Service had camps all over the country. The People's Militia had camps all over the country. And these were paramilitary organizations, which meant that they were armed.
Yeah, but does that mean that there were as many persons as one in every 35? Is that? You're still not telling us where you got that statistic from?
No, well, that is another statistic I can provide the source to you for. I can provide the source for that.
But Minister Rohi, apart from the paramilitary organizations, which we can assume for the moment, these were established by the state by some administrative or lawful authority. Let's deal with the House of Israel. If, as you said, members of the House of Israel were armed, it's either they were given firearm users licenses by the commissioner, who has the authority to do so, or they were using the firearms illegally, or they were loaned by one of the paramilitary organizations. Is there anything that you could check, or we could check to verify that the members of the House of Israel were indeed armed by the state?
I'm sorry, I can't help you with that. I'm not so sure whether there's any documentation that one can provide to show that the House of Israel was handed firearms by the state without those firearms being processed through the Firearms Act, according to the Firearms Act. But It was known in those days that House of Israel was armed. How did they procure the firearms? It must have been as a result of the concubinage between the PNC and the House of Israel.
Mr. Roy will return to the witness box on February 9 for cross-examination. Meantime, Labour Minister Dr. Nanda Gopal, during his cross-examination, said Dr. Rodney was a victim of raw violence meted out by state agents, recounting an incident that occurred during a public meeting at the Border Mall.
That meeting, the breaking up was ruthless, absolutely ruthless. I have not witnessed violence of that nature before unleashed on Guyanese by police, members of the police force, and members of the other militias, the House of Israel, etc.
Now, what precise time was that?
That was just after 5 in the afternoon, sir.
No, but what year are we talking about? How close to his death?
That was in and around 1978, 79, 78, late 78.
Would you say that after that period, Dr. Rodney's popularity continued and grew and in 78, 79 up to his death?
Yes, very much so.
And would you, in light of what you had witnessed in that period, this type of repression, that especially what you focus on in your paragraph 8 and 9, what was your interpretation then of the events of the 13th of June 1980?
As I said, I formed a strong belief that the People's National Congress and/or its leader and the police force, leaders of the military and police, had a hand in the death of Walter Rodney.
Assistant Lead Counsel to the Commission, Lachmi Rahamat, summed up the day's proceedings.
Well, Mr. Gopal returned to the Commission to have the cross-examination of his evidence completed. He has maintained that during the period, the policies implemented by the Burnham regime were oppressive, and that he insisted that there was not collective bargaining as is present today. And he went on to even give a practical example in relation to the control the administration and the then president was exercising over the judiciary. This came in the form of an article coming from the Caribbean Commonwealth Bar Association, which indicated in the article and highlighting the fact that President Burnham at the time had given a directive that black marketers were supposed to be jailed and not fined. And the article highlighted that he further stated that they would have to explain if any black marketers were in fact fined and not jailed. The organization, of course, comprising of lawyers, indicated that the judiciary must be independent and that the sentencing aspect or the sentencing discretion of a magistrate should not be controlled by the executive. You will recall that this goes back to the evidence of the witness from his examination in chief, even to the point where he gave examples and provided the commission with a picture of the building of the Court of Appeal, and on the building there was a party flag of the then Burnham administration hanging on the building of the Court of Appeal. Of course, Mr. Gopal indicated the inferences to be drawn from the presence of that flag on a building such as the Court of Appeal, the highest appeal court in Guyana at that time, that the administration was basically controlling different arms, including the judiciary, and he owed this all to and went back to the paramountcy of the party. And in applying that principle, the government had a hand in almost everything. And he also gave the example of the Ministry of National Development and the party office being in the same building. So we saw basically the conclusion of his evidence having been tested, and he offered insight from a trade unionist perspective because he was very active at the time. And something else came out that did not come out prior is that he, between 1993, was actually part of another opposition party. So his views expressed in relation to being an active trade unionist on the ground speaks volumes in relation to how the policies were actually affecting the sugar workers on the ground and the hardships they face.
Okay. And could we also get a sum up of Mr. Roy's evidence as presented today?
Well, Minister Rohi came to the box. Minister Rohi, now the Minister of Home Affairs of Guyana. He's also the General Secretary of the People's Progressive Party. And before he started his evidence, he went through what positions he held between 1978 and 1980. He was also serving on the executive of the People's Progressive Party between that period. We have to remember that the term of reference also asks whether or not there were surveillance being conducted by different agencies identified on opposition parties. He has stated in evidence that the PPP was an opposition party, and he has given detailed evidence in relation to the type of surveillance activity that was being carried out not only on himself personally, but also on the party office at its location in town, and also on Dr. Jagan. And he spoke specifically about a man on a motorcycle following Dr. Jagan, and he speaks from his own experience of observing this from his home. And if he goes to the party office, the person will follow him there, and if he goes in the afternoon to surgery, because he was a dentist at the time, the man would follow him there and even wait. What this tells us is that Minister Rohi is recollecting first-hand information coming to the commission that it was not only WPA members that were under surveillance and this type of strict surveillance, but we saw the mere fact that they were working in shifts, according to Minister Rohi, that the surveillance activities carried out on the PPP and its members, in particular Mr. Rohi and Dr. Jagan, was organized so that they worked in shifts to monitor their activities throughout the entire day and every day. He went on to indicate that he witnessed, like many other witnesses before, violence being perpetrated against the opposition parties. He witnessed the breaking up of these political meetings when Dr. Rodney and the WPA were having joint meetings with the PPP. He indicated that there was also surveillance activity conducted at the meeting, and you were able to identify these individuals conducting the surveillance by the way they operated. You're at a meeting, you wouldn't recognize the person, but they come so often, eventually you were able to pick out these people from the crowd because you would see them so often. They would be there taking pictures at the rallies, and they would also be taking notes, and they would not be interacting. And these were the means by which he used to discern who was conducting surveillance at the party meetings and public meetings, and therefore he was able to offer the commission evidence in relation to there being people, in his opinion, from special branch, which he said years later he managed to confirm. And this surveillance activity went on for quite a while. The minister also gave evidence in relation to how the economic circumstances that operated in the country at the time were affecting the people of Guyana. He said that the policies, the banning of food items, the mere fact that there was a restriction even resulting on the foreign exchange, these caused hardships even for people who were traveling, because you know now that if you need to leave the country, you would need foreign exchange to use when you get to the foreign jurisdiction. I believe we have evidence from Minister Rohi telling us that there was a very long process to go through. You have to fill out many forms, and eventually, if you do get through having filled out the forms, the most you'd be entitled to is $15 for your travels to and fro. We also see that he indicated that the people being affected by the food shortages and the discrimination in the distribution of the food that was present in Guyana also contributed to the PNC becoming isolated. It became such that there was dissatisfaction and the people were unhappy, and he indicated under oath that it resulted in strikes. This is an individual who is not only a serving minister right now, but back then he was in the opposition. And he did in fact give his first-hand information from his own personal knowledge as to what he remembers taking place back during the Burnham regime, and the effect it had not only on him, but also on his party supporters, and generally the people of Guyana. Another important point he touched on, which I will end on in this cast, is that he indicated that Dr. Rodney and Dr. Jagan would meet, and they would discuss their views and basically the way forward for both parties in relation to what it was that their collaboration, if any, should bring about. He said that these two men, after they would meet, Dr. Jagan would brief the other party members on what was discussed. There were some basic views that both men held, which included not only having a regime change, bringing about change, but the change should be and should result in betterment for the people of Guyana and to end the suffering. More or less, these men in their collaboration saw from a viewpoint where there was a need presently in the society between 1978 and 1980, and they required that there be mass movement in order to facilitate this change. Minister Rohi specifically said that at no point in time was there ever any talk of the use of violence to achieve this change or bring about this change in the regime. And he said that Dr. Jagan was a man who was non-violent, and he believed in the Mahatma Gandhi principles of change through mass movement as opposed to change through violent means. Minister Rohi's evidence is incomplete. He has to return to the commission, and we expect him to return sometime during the February session.